applications therein. Let's see. I am director of our incident response services, as mentioned. Also spent some time in the U.S. Air Force and prior at one of the Big Four as well. On June 27th, a destructive cyber attack was launched against the country of Ukraine, leveraging the NotPetya malware. A lot has been written about this attack, and my goal here today is really to give you perspective from in the trenches in dealing with this particular attack. Now, at CrowdStrike, we take our privacy and confidentiality of our customers very seriously. So this is not intended to be an expose on a single customer or necessarily follow one event, but rather a culmination of what we learned and saw through a wide variety of our investigations. Destructive malware, is certainly not a new thing. We've seen attacks on major companies like Sony, like Saudi Aramco. However, NotPetya was different. And it was different because this is the first time that thousands of multinational corporations were collateral damage to what was most likely a nation-on-nation cyber attack. It's unfortunate, but these companies were victims that fell within the blast radius of a targeted but not very well controlled attack. Before we jump in too deep here, I'd like to level set on a little bit on what NotPetya is and briefly on how NotPetya works. So first, NotPetya is not ransomware. You might say, okay, that's great, but why does it matter? Well, it matters for a couple of reasons. First reason, when you are responding to an incident and you don't know whether there's a chance that your files could be recovered, you will certainly operate a bit differently, right? If there's a possibility, a remote chance that you could decrypt files from hundreds and thousands of systems, critical systems, you may try to keep certain systems preserved as opposed to starting from scratch and rebuilding your entire network. Second, it's also important to distinguish that this is destructive in nature and not ransom because many insurance policies cover ransom or ransomware, but not all insurance policies cover destructive malware, nor do they all have provisions for acts that may be considered acts of war from one nation to another. When big money like that is at stake, it certainly becomes important what we call this malware. A key reason that NotPetya is not ransomware is that the actors behind the malware have not provided a legitimate means to decrypt files in exchange for some sort of monetary payment. But even more importantly is that the private key for one of the encryption algorithms that was used in NotPetya is discarded. It's overwritten during the process, making it impossible, nearly impossible, I should say, to recover the files and the data. We'll talk a little bit later about some of the possibilities due to a weak implementation of that encryption algorithm, but in general, the actors did not intend for this particular malware to be able to decrypt the files. We've seen quite an uptick here recently this past year in supply chain based software attacks. Our team at CrowdStrike has reported on over half a dozen of them just in the last calendar year. Two that come to mind being the Handbrake was backdoored, and that application allowed the Apple Mac OS to be used to drop Proton malware. We also saw a CC cleaner being backdoored, the adware capability, and similarly, NotPetya has leveraged the MEDOCS software to be distributed throughout the customer environments. MEDOCS is an application that is used in Ukraine to interact with the tax system there by many businesses. And that's precisely what these attackers used to deliver the destructive payload. What I thought was even more interesting is that our team, leveraging some of the telemetry data we collect within our endpoint protection platform, we found that another version of ransomware called Xdata was delivered via that same MEDOCS backdoor between mid-May, about May 15th, up until about June 9th. And an interesting aspect of that is May 30th, so about halfway through the campaign, that we see the actors randomly release the decryption key for the Xdata malware, which is not very typical of financially motivated attackers, to release the key that would allow you to decrypt your files. Additionally, this Xdata was targeting Ukraine, and most financially motivated attackers tend to target more wealthy countries. Xdata does have some similarities to NotPetya. It checks for an antivirus when it operates, and if the dropper will terminate if the antivirus Kaspersky is running on a system. It also uses PSExec to move laterally, and provides email as a payment mechanism rather than having some sort of an automated method set up for payment. So being manual typically indicates an attacker who's less motivated on making money and more on causing havoc. Based on our analysis of Xdata and the events surrounding it, we believe it's likely this malware was being used to test the MEDOCS backdoor in preparation for the NotPetya attacks. Compromising software supply chain is not new to Ukraine in terms of being a threat. On May 15th of this year, the Ukrainian president actually banned a leading Russian software called 1C. They banned it after the SBU, roughly the equivalent of the FBI in Ukraine, had done some raids and found some information indicating that 1C was being used as spy software. On three separate occasions, the attackers behind NotPetya, which you see in red on the timeline up here, they leveraged the MEDOCS application to deliver modified versions of the backdoor. So April 14th, May 15th, and June 22nd, in order to prepare for these attacks. At one point, I actually had a placeholder on this slide for NotPetya 2.0, indicating it's only really likely a matter of time before we experience another software-based supply chain attack, similar and perhaps even larger in size and scale to NotPetya. As a matter of fact, October 14th, right around the Ukrainian Holiday Defender Day, the SBU in Ukraine released an advisory of a heightened risk of that exact same type of an attack. While that turned out to be a false scare, if you will, it certainly got companies who were impacted and infected by NotPetya a bit alarmed. Now that we got a little bit of the background on what NotPetya is, I'd like to really briefly level set on how it works. First, when NotPetya runs on a system, it utilizes Mimikatz to dump plain text usernames and passwords out of memory. It then, step 2, attempts to gather a list of the IP addresses of systems that it's been collecting or contacting around it recently or active connections. Leveraging the combination of those IP addresses and then the plain text usernames and passwords, it attempts to propagate itself in step 3, moving laterally throughout an environment, leveraging PSExec as well as WMI. If the authentication attempts fail, The malware then reverts to the Eternal Blue, Eternal Romance exploits that were popularized by WannaCry, released by the Shadow Brokers back in April of this year. The kind of final step is the system encrypts 65 unique file types. It encrypts the first megabyte of those files, and then sets itself to reboot, and then upon reboot it performs a second layer of encryption. NotPetya, really demonstrated that a cyber attack by a motivated threat actor can have secondary and tertiary effects that impact really our way of life as Americans and the way that our companies do business. While everyone was out enjoying a nice 4th of July holiday, perhaps a barbecue, our team spent that week huddled up in conference rooms and data centers, helping our clients respond to and recover from these attacks. While the impacts lasted through the holiday, they originally preceded Ukraine's Constitution Day. It's certainly not uncommon for threat actors to launch attacks coinciding with major holidays of the victims. Perhaps dig the knife in and turn it a little bit, make it tougher that you're missing those holidays with your families. But in any case, the cases that we supported, IT, security, leadership, and other staff worked around the clock. We had some of our team members spending 18+ hour days in data centers investigating and recovering from these attacks. One of our clients had even set up some cots in a conference room and even brought in a massage therapist to help folks deal with some of the stress of responding to these situations. It was truly an effort to get crippled businesses back up and operational. The total losses are still really being calculated, but few of the large companies are estimating as much as $300 million in damages. You can imagine the kind of stress that puts on a business and creates within the context of an office. Another element we found is that adds to kind of the stress of investigations are news stories, particularly when the headlines are catchy and easy to take out of context. This is not, really not necessarily unique to NotPetya, but there were several times throughout these NotPetya investigations that at least I felt like somebody had launched some sort of an information operations campaign focused on distraction and deception. Perhaps this was just an unintended consequence or side effect, but the confusion surrounding possible payment methods as well as abilities to decrypt data can certainly wreak havoc on organizations. I'll skip over kind of the initial ransom note that was provided, indicating that for about $300 in Bitcoin, you could recover your data. I think we all are pretty well aware of that, seen that black and red text. But about a week after the initial attacks, an actor appeared on the dark webs asking for asking for exactly 100 Bitcoin, which is roughly equivalent to about $250,000 US payment in exchange for the RSA private key that would allow the decryption of any hard drive. The actor actually went so far as to prove they had the private key by decrypting a Word document that had been encrypted with NotPetya. However, not long after that, the actor just went dark, and we certainly still do not have that key. About 2 weeks after the initial attack, another actor popped up on Facebook, an actor who goes by the name Green Tuda. You see his email address there at tudamail.com. He claimed via Pastebin that he had a NotPetya private key and was willing to sell it. Our intel team actually reached out to Green TUDA, and when we pressed the actor for proof that he had the key, he went dark and stopped responding. We additionally had traced this actor back to some web forum and hacking sites where he had claimed to have access to Facebook, as well as some Android devices that he was willing to sell. As we had suspected initially, the actor it turned out to be a scammer. Well, none of those claims had panned out, or that news rang true. There is some hope. Before we get too deep into that, I'd like to talk a little bit about how the encryption on NotPetya works. So initially, when the file encryption happens, NotPetya encrypts just the first megabyte of the 65 target files, leveraging a randomly generated AES 128-bit key. The reason they're targeting the first 1 megabyte is likely for efficiency and effectiveness reasons. The NotPetya malware has a scheduled task to reboot after 1 hour, in which case the system becomes entirely inoperable. Encrypting large files can certainly take a lot of time, but if you just encrypt the first megabyte of a file, that generally has a lot of the metadata that's important to access and render a file, you're going to be much more effective at encrypting a larger portion of the disk. After the AES encryption, the AES 128-bit key is then encrypted with an RSA 2048 public key. This key is then stored in disk, on disk in a ransom note that can be recovered later. NotPetya then performs an antivirus check. If it identifies the Kaspersky antivirus, it overwrites the first 10 sectors of the physical drive with random data. This can really, trivially, it's pretty trivial to recover from that, leveraging a Windows boot disk. But it should be noted that the files targeted for AES encryption would still be encrypted, even though you could recover with a boot disk. For any other antivirus outside of Kaspersky, the malware then encrypts the MFT leveraging Salsa 20 algorithm. So this is the second round of encryption. During this process, though, the 16-bit private key for Salsa 20 is overwritten. It's discarded. It's really unrecoverable. Thus, the malware really provides no legitimate means to recover the MFT or the data. It's only because of a weaker implementation of the Salsa 20 algorithm that it is possible to decrypt and recover some of the files encrypted by Salsa 20. I first, want to caveat this that any files that were initially encrypted by AES cannot be recovered by this method, but files that were not targeted may, have the ability to be recovered. So if it doesn't match one of the 65 file extensions, or if the AES encryption algorithm didn't have enough time to encrypt the entire drive, it's potential that some of those 65 files could be recovered. And then kind of lastly, the AES encryption mechanism runs under a specific user account, and if a device or a laptop or a server has additional user accounts with files owned by other users, there's a chance that those could also be recovered. But while it's certainly a tedious and time-consuming process to recover this data, our team has had a good bit of success in doing this, leveraging a combination of a known plaintext attack and a many-time pad attack. this is possible because the Salsa 20 algorithm was implemented leveraging in a suboptimal fashion. Basically, instead of using a byte offset in the stream of data to be encrypted, NotPetya uses the numbering of the respective sector, which is highly repetitive, and it causes significant consequences for the security of this particular implementation. So how does this work? Well, first, in order to decrypt Salsa 20, the MFT needs to be decrypted. The good part about the MFT is it's almost an ideal data structure for a known plaintext attack. If we have certain knowledge about the underlying plaintext, we can calculate the original key stream by XORing the ciphertext with the plaintext. Due to the repetitive nature of this particular keystream implementation, this knowledge can be then exploited to derive large portions of the keystream. With the MFT decrypted, or at least parts of the MFT decrypted, files can then be decrypted leveraging the keystream derived from that MFT decryption process. Again, this won't decrypt files targeted for AES encryption, but it certainly has been a pretty interesting journey for us and our team. While it's not a flawless approach, we've had success with several clients recovering some of their most critical data. Since decryption is a tedious process and should be focused on really just the most valuable data, our team has had to get pretty creative when it came to investigating NotPetya attacks. Investigating a destructive malware attack like NotPetya can sometimes feel like trying to investigate and understand how a plane blew up in midair over the ocean. NotPetya malware covers its tracks, and it also renders systems inoperable, making the forensic data available on those systems really, not of value or ability to recover that. In addition to kind of the endpoints that are affected, for those companies who may be leveraging logging or SIM solutions that run on Windows operating systems, there's a complicating fact of those potentially becoming infected by NotPetya and losing visibility from a log perspective in the middle of a destructive malware attack like this. To complement this, we found a decent amount of success with our Falcon Forensics Collector triage script, which focuses on running on endpoints, laptops, workstations, gathering historical forensic data. Specifically, we found systems that were not infected to be rich with authentication attempts as well as SMB connections. The SMB connections, I was actually kind of surprised to find within the context of Linux servers that were serving up SMB shares. We had initially kind of debated whether or not to target those servers, but they did provide quite a rich set of data. So in order to scope a NotPetya investigation or NotPetya destructive malware campaign, there's kind of two primary areas we look with some key technical indicators. First the logs, I talked about that. Looking at perfc.dat, which is the vaccine for NotPetya, as well as indications of DLL host.dat being written to disk, DLL host.dat being psexec. There some evidence in logs around scheduled tasks being created to shut down systems, event logs being cleared, as well as successful login activity. From an endpoint perspective, you wouldn't see successful logins because those systems would be infected and rendered inoperable, but failed login activity can certainly point out who was infected, as well as antivirus logs, particularly identifying execution and preventing the double pulsar backdoor. So putting this into pictures, what does it look like? Well, what you're looking at here are two things. First, on the top is around propagation of the NotPetya malware. To your left is authentication attempts 10 minutes prior to a NotPetya attack between specific systems. To the right are authentication attempts during the peak and height of a NotPetya attack. You can really see kind of the drastic difference in number of connections. On the bottom of this slide, what you see are SMB connection activity within an organization. You can, prior to kind of that 10:30 a.m. UTC mark, you can see there's kind of a pretty low baseline of SMB activity, at which point it becomes, you know, pretty linear increase in activity as the malware continues to spread. Based on our involvement in organizations in these investigations, we saw that the NotPetya malware tended to spread between about a 2 and 4 hour period of time before it rendered itself pretty inoperable. So this is all interesting information, but you know, I think it begs the question: what can we do about it? What can we do to prepare our organizations? Well, first, let's look specifically at a NotPetya and an MEDOCS type environment. We know that the MEDOCS delivered the weaponized payload through a backdoor, so certainly could find value there from isolating the MEDOCS server or other high-risk applications from the rest of a network, implementing application whitelisting on those systems, and having some sort of a process to vet application updates. In addition to that, important elements around containment being securing account usages, leveraging password vaults in order to check in and check out credentials, as well as segmenting access around you know, what privileges and systems and business units that particular accounts can access. In order to, you know, destructive malware-proof your organization, if you will, there's certainly some longer-term transformation efforts that are important. I think it's pretty apparent that a disaster recovery plan with backups, but also from a prevention perspective, I know leveraging the endpoint protection, we saw a lot of success with our Falcon technology, proactively blocking the NotPetya attacks based on some behavior-based alerting and prevention capabilities we have. And then containing the spread through network and account credential segmentation. Like anything we do in our industry, there is no silver bullet. It takes coordinated defenses, you know, across the air, land, and sea, or at least the cyber equivalent therein, to prepare for and recover from these types of attacks. Thank you for your time today. If you have any questions or want to connect, I'll be around.